The struggle against COVID is the single biggest crisis the world has faced in my lifetime. In less than a year, this disease has killed almost 1 million people and caused havoc to economies everywhere. Here in the UK, we mourn every person we have lost and we grieve with their families. And yet I'm more certain than ever that this is a struggle that humanity will win, and we in this country will win. And to achieve what we must, I want to talk to you directly tonight about the choices that we face, none of them easy, and why we must take action now. I know that we can succeed because we have succeeded before. When the sickness took hold in this country in March, we pulled together in a spirit of national sacrifice and community. We followed the guidance to the letter. We stayed at home, protected the NHS, and saved thousands of lives. And for months, with those disciplines of social distancing, we've kept that virus at bay. But we have to acknowledge that this is a great and freedom-loving country, and while the vast majority have complied with the rules, there have been too many breaches, too many opportunities for our invisible enemy to slip through undetected. The virus has started to spread again in an exponential way. Infections are up, hospital admissions are climbing. We can see what's happening in France and Spain. And we know, alas, that this virus is no less fatal than it was in the spring, and that the vast majority of our people are no less susceptible. And the iron laws of geometrical progression are shouting at us from the graphs that we risk many more deaths, many more families losing loved ones before their time. And I know that faced with that risk, the British people will want their government to continue to fight to protect them, you. And that's what we're doing night and day. And yet the single greatest weapon we bring to this fight is the common sense of the people themselves, the joint resolve of this country to work together to suppress COVID now. So today I set out a package of tougher measures in England. Early closing for pubs, bars, table service only, closing businesses that are not COVID secure, expanding the use of face coverings, new fines for those that fail to comply, once again asking office workers to work from home if they can, while enforcing the rule of 6 indoors and outdoors. A tougher package of national measures combined with the potential for tougher local restrictions for areas already in lockdown. I know that this approach, robust but proportionate, already carries the support of all the main parties in Parliament. After discussion with colleagues in the devolved administrations, I believe this broad approach is shared across the whole UK. And to those who say we don't need this stuff and we should leave people to take their own risks, I say these risks are not our own. The tragic reality of having COVID is that your mild cough can be someone else's death knell. And as for the suggestion that we should simply lock up the elderly and the vulnerable, with all the suffering that would entail, I must tell you that this is just not realistic. Because if you let the virus rip through the rest of the population, it would inevitably find its way through to the elderly as well, and in much greater numbers. That's why we need to suppress the virus now. And as for that minority who may continue to flout the rules, we will enforce those rules with tougher penalties and fines of up to £10,000. We will put more police out on the streets and use the army to backfill if necessary. And of course, I'm deeply spiritually reluctant to make any of these impositions or infringe anyone's freedom. But unless we take action, the risk is that we will have to go for tougher measures later when the deaths have already mounted and we have a huge caseload of infection such as we had in the spring. If we let this virus get out of control now, it would mean that our NHS had no space, once again, to deal with cancer patients and millions of other non-COVID medical needs. And if we were forced into a new national lockdown, that would threaten not just jobs and livelihoods, but the loving human contact on which we all depend. It would mean renewed loneliness and confinement for the elderly and vulnerable, and ultimately it would threaten once again the education of our children. We must do all we can to avoid going down that road again. But if people don't follow the rules we've set out, then we must reserve the right to go further. We must take action now, because a stitch in time saves 9. And this way, we can keep people in work, we can keep our shops and our schools open, and we can keep our country moving forward while we work together to suppress the virus. That is our strategy. And if we can follow this package together, then I know we can succeed, because in so many ways, we're better prepared than before. We have the PPE, we have the beds, we have the nightingales, we have new medicines pioneered in this country that can help save lives. And though our doctors and our medical advisors are rightly worried about the data now and the risks over winter, they are unanimous that things will be far better by the spring, when we have not only the hope of a vaccine, but one day soon, and I must stress that we're not there yet, of mass testing so efficient that people will be able to be tested in minutes so they can do more of the things they love. That's the hope, that's the dream. It's hard, but it's attainable, and we're working as hard as we can to get there. But until we do, we must rely on our willingness to look out for each other, to protect each other. Never in our history has our collective destiny and our collective health depended so completely on our individual behavior. If we follow these simple rules together, we will get through this winter together. There are unquestionably difficult months to come, and the fight against COVID is by no means over. And I have no doubt, however, that there are great days ahead. But now is the time for us all to summon the discipline and the resolve and the spirit of togetherness that will carry us through.
Good evening. That was a special broadcast by the Prime Minister on the coronavirus pandemic. We're staying on air to digest and analyse this, the most significant tightening of restrictions since the nationwide lockdown in March. So let's just recap then what we've just heard on the situation in England. The Prime Minister is now telling people to work from home if possible, and that is, of course, a U-turn on what he was saying only days ago. As of Thursday, pubs and restaurants must close between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. Starting next week, face coverings will be mandatory in more places, including for staff, in shops and taxis, and also in restaurants and pubs if you're not sitting at a table. Weddings will be limited to 15 people. That's half the current limit. While plans to try to get sports fans back at events have been put on hold. The Prime Minister admitted the new rules could be in place for 6 months tonight, saying there are unquestionably difficult months to come. He warned if people don't follow the rules we've set out, then we must reserve the right to go further. But he also urged unity, saying now is the time for us all to summon the discipline and the resolve and the spirit of togetherness that will carry us through. That's what he said just a couple of minutes ago, and I'm joined now by our political editor, Robert Peston, and our health editor, Emily Morgan. Turning to you first, Robert, your thoughts. What did you make of what the Prime Minister said?
So the Prime Minister often sets himself up as a divisive figure over Brexit, for example. Today, he was trying to be a unifying Prime Minister, urging all of us to do our bit, to follow the rules, distance from others, and defeat this awful virus. And one of the reasons why he's urging us to, in his view, behave better is because his scientists have warned him both that the virus is increasing really quite rapidly everywhere, but also, I'm afraid to say, they don't think he has necessarily done enough. I mean, there's one major new announcement, which we've been actually, it says predicting for days now, which is that, pubs and restaurants have to shut at 10, can't reopen till 5. Pretty much everything else he's doing is a tightening up of existing regulations. And despite those regulations, we're seeing, as I say, the virus rising. I'm talking to a member of SAGE this evening. He is fearful that we are going to see further measures to restrict our freedom, and you only have to go north of the border to have a preview of what that is, because Nicola Sturgeon today went further than the Prime Minister. She said her medical scientific advisors had told her that what the Prime Minister was proposing was not enough. And so she has tightened up this so-called rule of 6, which means we can't meet in groups of more than 6 inside a house socially. And she said no household now can mix with another household, because she says that's where the virus is spreading. And I fear we may see some of that south of the border in areas that aren't currently locked down. Of course, in many lockdown areas, that's already happening.
All right, well, let's turn to Emily, health editor. You've been talking to the experts all day. What do they make of these new restrictions?
Well, they're really very mixed, and it's interesting, isn't it? We had the 2 top scientists come out yesterday and say that we really need to act fast and we need to act with enough force in order to bring the number of cases of coronavirus down. And actually, from that address, I think many scientists, many people have saying that very, very little has changed, as Robert has been saying, that they're really calling on us to simply curb our social life and follow the guidance. Yes, scientists say that closing pubs and restaurants early will have an effect, a small effect. It means people will leave early, that they won't drink so much, and that they're more likely to follow the guidance when they go home. And ditto working from home. People are less likely to see fewer people, and there's a chance that they won't pass the virus on as much. But, and this is a big but, there's a whole raft of scientists who simply feel that they haven't gone far enough, that these measures aren't draconian enough. And the other surprise, Robert touched on it, is this restriction that the government hasn't applied to England, the ban on mixing in households. We know that the transmission of the virus is in households, so that's a real surprise. And there's a warning tonight that if we don't follow this guidance, there will be more measures in the future.
OK, Emily, for the moment, thank you. And as it become familiar during the coronavirus crisis, as Robert mentioned, the devolved nations of the UK have all taken slightly different stances. Emily picked on that too. We have correspondents in Glasgow, Cardiff and Belfast to take us through these various variations. And first to our political reporter, Shihab Khan, who's in Glasgow. Now, Shihab, Nicola Sturgeon has spoken tonight after imposing, as we mentioned, stronger measures for Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Robert mentioned, there is divergence between what's going on in England and in Scotland. Barring a few exceptions, household mixing will no longer be allowed. Now, that is already applies to large parts of Scotland, including in and around Glasgow, but it will now apply nationally. Now, Nicola Sturgeon says that she's aware that having eased lockdown, that she's now asking people to make significant sacrifices.
I know that today must feel like a step backwards. But please know that thanks to all your efforts over the last 6 months, we are in a much stronger position now than in the spring. Cases are rising, but less rapidly than back then. Our test and protect system is working well. It is tracing contacts and breaking chains of transmission.
Now, Nicola Sturgeon has repeatedly been accused of undermining the Prime Minister, looking at similar data with different advisors and drawing different conclusions about what needs to be done. A senior Scottish government source told me that they looked at the data and they thought household mixing in Scotland was the reason why there'd been a spike in the number of cases. They informed Number 10 that they were taking a different approach to try and slow down the spread of the virus.
OK, Shihab Khan in Glasgow, thank you. And our Wales correspondent, Rupert Evelyn, joins me now from Cardiff. So, Rupert, talk us through the new rules then in Wales.
Well, they've only just been published here in Wales. The top line, I think, is that what Wales is sort of following what England is doing in terms of hospitality, businesses. There will be a restriction on anything from pubs to supermarkets closing and selling alcohol after 10 p.m. Some support, £500 for those on low incomes who are forced to self-isolate. The overriding message, I think, from the First Minister, Mark Drayford, is one of an impending crisis that could potentially be averted, but he really isn't downplaying the seriousness of COVID.
In the weeks and months ahead of us, there is a very real possibility that we could see the virus regain a foothold. We now need everybody to follow the rules and guidance and to take the steps to protect them and their loved ones.
Well, no direct reference to the stay local rules that form part of the first lockdown here, but a reminder from the Welsh Government that if we limit the number of people we come into contact with, that is an extremely effective way of limiting the spread of the virus.
OK, Rupert Evelyn in Cardiff, thank you. And finally, let's go to John Ray in Belfast. John, Northern Ireland announced new measures yesterday. They've now come into force tonight. What is different there from the rest of the UK?
Well, Mary, in two unwelcome and important respects, Northern Ireland is ahead of the rest of the United Kingdom. Firstly, sadly, in the rate of infection, around 1,000 positive cases within the past week, worse too, incidentally, than the Republic of Ireland. So, as a consequence, as of 6 o'clock tonight, it was no longer permitted for someone to invite neighbours, friends, family members from another household into their home. There are important exceptions to that. In people's gardens, then it's the familiar rule of six. So with some doors shut, others are opening. It sounds contradictory that Northern Ireland tomorrow will allow the reopening of pubs which sell only alcohol, so-called wet pubs here. It does sound a bit odd. That's because the authorities here believe that the virus is spreading through people's homes and not in social settings. And speaking within the last few minutes, the First Minister, Arlene Foster, has put Northern Ireland on notice for potentially further restrictions ahead. Here's what she said.
We need to act. But I do want to reassure you that despite all of the headlines, this is not a second lockdown. This is a wake-up call, a reminder that we are not out of the woods.
The Deputy First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, said today that in some respects the situation in Northern Ireland now is more concerning than it was back at the beginning in March.
John Ray in Belfast, thank you. OK, it's time for us to take a quick break now, but we will be back very shortly to assess the impact of today's measures on the economy. Do join us then. Welcome back to an ITV News special to mark the most significant tightening of lockdown measures nationwide since they were first introduced back in March. The Prime Minister addressed the nation in the past half hour, warning of a tough winter ahead.
If we follow these simple rules together, we will get through this winter together. There are unquestionably difficult months to come, and the fight against COVID is by no means over. And I have no doubt, however, that there are great days ahead. But now is the time for us all to summon the discipline and the resolve and the spirit of togetherness that will carry us through.
OK, well, let's talk about the impact of that statement on the economy with our economics editor, Joel Hills, who's at a pub in Kent. Joel, really tough news for the hospitality industry today, but how worried will the whole business world be about the Prime Minister's warnings tonight, about further restrictions which could be further down the line?
Well, these restrictions are a major setback, clearly, for pubs, restaurants, bars, cafes, casinos and football clubs who were hoping that the worst was over and behind them. The new rules do not come with additional financial support for businesses, and the furlough scheme ends in 5 weeks' time. The chief executive of Shepherd Neame, which owns this pub and around 300 others, warns that there'll be job losses on a biblical scale unless the government either extends that scheme or comes up with something to replace it. There is no indication at the moment that the government is intending to do either of those things. This morning, Whitbread, which owns hotels and restaurants, announced plans to lay off up to a fifth of its workforce. The clear concern here is that we face the prospect of a very sharp rise in unemployment. Now, a national lockdown has been avoided for now. Schools and businesses will remain open, and we have showed over the last 6 months that working from home can be made to work. But although these measures are perhaps milder than some people feared, they are looking like they'll be with us for some considerable amount of time, absent the discovery, of course, of an effective vaccine, and that is causing inevitable concern. It's likely to slow the recovery down. The Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, indicated as much at a conference today. Tonight, economists will be downgrading their economic forecasts, although probably not by much. The real hammer blow here, Mary, will be felt by companies in a limited number of sectors.
OK, Joel in Kent, thank you. And let's return to Robert and Emily for a final thought. Emily, Robert's talking about terrible economic damage that could be wreaked by this. And at some point, that's going to have a real impact on health, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. That is the problem, and that is the balancing act. We all know that stopping the spread of coronavirus is ensuring that people don't die or they don't get ill, but the economic fallout could be just as damaging to our health as coronavirus itself, and it is already happening. I was talking to a doctor this afternoon who was saying up to 40% of her patients are coming in with mental health issues. They are concerned about losing their job, the furlough scheme ending, they can't pay their rent, they're lonely. Those are just the sorts of issues that the government is worried about if it doesn't protect the economy. Any recession means an increase in poverty and deprivation, and that has a huge impact on everybody's health across the nation.
Emily, thank you very much indeed. And let's final word to you, Robert. Emily's talking about balance. Has the Prime Minister got this right? I mean, he's sort of damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, isn't he?
I mean, look, the truth is, I don't know. The Prime Minister doesn't know because he is getting all sorts of different information from different people. I spoke earlier about his own advisors saying the rate of increase in this virus is very troubling. There are other data scientists and virus experts who are reputable, who think we've already seen a slowing down in the rate of increase. And they also point out, which is undoubtedly the case, that it is much worse in some parts of the country than in others. And they say we'd be much better off simply targeting action in particular parts of the UK rather than having a great new raft of UK measures. But although I said earlier that the Prime Minister's own advisors, who are more pessimistic, wish he'd done more, the fact is that what he has announced is economically damaging. People not going back to the office, that will have a profound impact, for example, on city centres. So I'm afraid he doesn't know, I don't know whether he's got it right. All I do know is we've got a long period of uncertainty ahead of us.
OK, Robert, Peston and Emily Morgan, thank you very much indeed. And that is it from this special programme tonight, and yet another momentous and pretty worrying day for the nation. It's just 2 months since the Prime Minister declared social distancing could be over by Christmas. Tonight he addressed the nation from Downing Street to say there are unquestionably difficult months to come. The new measures are likely to be in place for 6 months, Boris Johnson said. It's already been 6 since he announced the first lockdown back in March. His most positive note tonight was that the government scientists all believe that things will be far better by next spring. And it's with that bit of hope, slight though it is, that we leave you. From all of us here, good night, stay safe, and thank you for watching.